Boccaccio begins the Decameron with a curious introduction. After the Proemio, he launches into this long description of what was going on in the world around him. And what was going on was the Black Plague. In late 1347, historians believe that it was ships arriving from Asia were bringing trading ships, were bringing goods, and along with the goods came some rats. It had fleas or ticks, and those ticks carried a form of the plague, and this just ravaged Europe. I think the estimate or something like, well, it ravaged the entire world, honestly. I think something like 50% of the world's population died in this. It was a catastrophe unlike any we had seen before. There had been plagues before. There had never been one on this scale that we are aware of. That's what was going on in Florence in the spring of 1348. Boccaccio says, he starts out very genteelly, again picking up on the what he mentioned in the Proemio about, I'm writing this for all the young women in love out there, but he says, every time I think of this, gentle ladies, or what was the term he used, graziosime donne, very artful and arch phrasing of it, fairest lady. It's a kind of arch courtesy. And every time I think of how decent you are and how pious and compassionate you are by nature, I suddenly realize what the context is of what I'm laying out in this work. And then he goes on to discuss the Black Plague. And historians to this day look at his account as a pretty significant contribution to the records of that day. There weren't particularly wide-scale medical records, so his account of what it was like is really important. And he gives a remarkable amount of space to it. He apologizes to the women for having to do this and says, but don't worry. In the very first paragraph that he's addressing them, he says, don't worry, we're going to talk about this, but you can, and this might dissuade you from reading any further, but I want to promise you that it will get better. The story will entertain you. You will find laughter and joy and inspiration in this work once you get through this initial unpleasantness. And he kind of downplays it a little, which you get a sense is almost being a bit ironic. He apologizes for that, but still he includes it. This is part of his work, and it sticks out because he then goes around and he doesn't make it part of his art. He doesn't make it part of the stories. It is just a very detailed description of what was going on, what the disease was, how it affected people physically, socially, and he catalogs all this in a really remarkable few paragraphs. I say then that the sum of 1,348 years had passed since the birth of Christ, when the noble city of Florence, where he is, which for its great beauty excels all others in Italy, was visited by this deadly pestilence. Some say it is descended upon the human race through the influence of the heavenly bodies, others that it was a punishment signifying God's righteous anger at our iniquitous way of life. But whatever the cause, it had originated some years earlier in the Orient, where it had claimed countless lives before it unhappily spread westward, growing in strength as it swept relentlessly on from one place to the next. Right there, that's a remarkably global perspective on a pandemic. It's not quite so lighthearted and frivolous as he sometimes puts on to be. There's a greater concern there. The reference to God, I would say, is significant also because he is offering a comparison, I would say, between the consideration of, well, God did this. This is the work of God. God is all powerful, and people by the millions are dying, God must want this to happen. The morality, the ethics, the justice, the goodness of that concept is somewhat striking when you see everybody dying around you. But then he compares that in that, saying, well, okay, some say that this is God's righteous anger. But then, no, that's when he gives right after that very simple and global assessment of the pandemic, saying, well, no, from all the best evidence we have, this began in the Orient, in the East, and worked its way towards us and then swept straight across, which is a scientific approach to it. And in sharp contradistinction to the religious explanation, which he seems to discount here, saying some say that he is positing a more concrete and worldly explanation. And he's saying, we don't have to get into God on this. Let's just address what we can. And he gives a remarkable description for this that, again, medical schools can still reference. On the earliest symptoms in men and women alike was the appearance of certain swellings in the groin and the armpit, some of which were egg-shaped, while others roughly the size of a common apple. That's fairly impressive medical information that he's giving there. Observation. He is looking around and taking note of everything that is as it is, and not just saying, well, he must have been a sinner, so God is punishing him. He's saying, well, no, let's look a little bit more closely here. Oh, okay. He's got these pustules forming. They're roughly this size. They tend to be here and there, sometimes over here. They range in size from this size to this size. And it's a completely different project than just saying, well, God is punishing us, which is in sharp contrast, I would say, to the standard medieval mode of being utterly bewildered by God and submitting absolutely to just, well, this is what God wants, and who am I to try and assume or begin to think that I can guess the mind of God? I can't. I'm just going to sit here and say, well, this is what God wants. That's the way it is, folks. No, he is sitting there and saying, well, okay, no, I'm going to use my God gift of reason and try and probe this a little bit. I'm going to try and take note of everything that's happening. And that's an important distinction, that little shift when he says, well, okay, maybe we don't have to just accept this. Maybe we can think about it and try and make things better for us here, because whether this is coming from God or not, I don't know. But I'm sure as anything that I want to try and help our condition here. If God is punishing us, fine, but we can still band together. God's going to punish us regardless, but we can try and make things just a little bit better. And he talks about the symptoms. He talks about the lack of medical knowledge. Perhaps the nature of the illness was that there was no remedy, or perhaps the people treating the illness didn't know what they were talking about, didn't know really what they were doing. This is very, this is pretty barbaric, essentially, medicine. There was no medicine, as it were. There had been scientists going back centuries at this point who had been cataloging medical information as best they could, but they had no scientific method. They knew nothing. And it really hadn't changed at all from the days of Hippocrates and Galen in the Greek era to the Middle Ages. They were essentially the same thing. They knew practically nothing. At any event, few who caught it ever recovered. And he talks about how quickly it spread. He talks about not only did it infect the healthy people, uh, who had any dealings with the sick, but sometimes it could be transferred on clothing, which is a remarkable stat that you're getting more data about this. Oh, okay, it could be transferred on clothing. It wasn't just skin-to-skin contact or aerosolized. It could be carried on clothing. And he talks about how quickly it could have an effect within just a few days, he says, for human beings. And he also references, like, there was a story or he saw something or somebody saw something about pigs who a piece of clothing or something had fallen off one of the corpses, one of the victims, and pigs came and started like pulling apart at the clothing and getting it all over their mouths and stuff. And within a couple hours, I think, the pigs died. And they said, within a short time, they began to writhe as though they had been poisoned. Then both dropped dead to the ground, spread-eagled on the rags. That's sudden, and it's shocking, and it's horrifying. And in this horror that's unfolding, he also catalogs some of the social reactions to it, some of the effects of this fear. And he says that, well, some people, just became very strict and very correct in their behavior, and they didn't go out, and they sat and they had very carefully moderated meals, and they didn't indulge in anything. They didn't drink too much. They had very straight, simple, okay, let's ride this out and get through it. And then he talks about how other people just took the opposite approach and said, well, if it's going to get me, it's going to get me. What am I going to do? For now, eat, drink, and be merry. And they would drink, and they would party, and they would go out and do all sorts of stuff and, go on spring break and just behave like a jackass. And they all died indiscriminately. There was no pattern that he was able to find that suggested that the people who were very correct and didn't do anything and just pulled back, they died, or that the hey, good time Charlie guys go out and drinking all the time, that they all died too. And he could find no real evidence that it was attacking one more than the other. Curious little social phenomenon that doctors today, these scientists today, trying to track pandemics and see, well, what kind of behaviors exacerbates or what kind of behaviors can ameliorate or mitigate is the term they tend to use. What can we do? Nobody knew. And the fear was starting to really set in. He talks about how some people, just out of fear of it, instead of incarcerating themselves, quarantining, social distancing, they would go around town, but with a little bunch of flowers or flower petals in their hand or in a handkerchief or something that they could hold to their face, because the smell of decaying bodies was everywhere. This is just pre-sanitation, and that's one of the reasons that led to the spread of the disease to begin with. But it was just filthy. And you picture these old, small, I don't know if you've ever been to Florence, but they're in the old part of town. The buildings are very closely together. The streets are very narrow, and there's not a lot of wind that's going to be blowing through there. It's very close quarters, very packed, and the air is going to get very foul very fast. He talks about how some people would just abandon the city, get out of town. Okay, fine, it's striking here in the city really bad. I can see that, and it's disgusting. Let's just leave. And a lot, especially the wealthier people who might have, weekend houses out of town, little suburban getaways. And they would do that. And they would find that a lot of those people tended to die too. There wasn't a lot of logic to it. He tracks the somewhat heartbreaking phenomenon of people starting to neglect one another, to social distance but more out of fear than any understanding. Not merely a question of one citizen avoiding another, and of people invariably neglecting their neighbors and rarely or ever visiting their relatives, addressing them only from a distance. The scourge had implanted so great a terror in the hearts of men and women that brothers abandoned brothers, uncles their nephews, sisters their brothers, and in many cases wives deserted their husbands. But even worse and most incredible was the fact that fathers and mothers refused to nurse or assist their own children. Which is horrible, but it also shows where Boccaccio is going with this. The greatest calamity. He's cataloging all of these different effects, and the one of the greatest calamities that he's noticing is that it's dividing people. It is ripping them apart from one another so that they cannot take solace from one another, which makes you think of, again, the Proemio, where he says that his guiding purpose in this is to provide some solace and bring people together. He talks a little bit more about the social breakdowns that happen, that in a crisis, the rules of society tend to relax. Proper upper crust, wealthy women would normally be very, insist on having only the right kinds of servants around. And if you have, these wealthy, generally older women would need help getting dressed and ready for bed and all that. And of course, their maids all had to be women to do that, or otherwise it would be a little improper. But as everybody starts dying, these social restrictions, these taboos start to fall away, because they'll just take any help that they can get to get through the day. And if a man has to help them undress at the end of the day, that's what they're willing to do. So social codes start evolving, start relaxing, perhaps. In the face of the crisis, any crisis, people change. The traditions around religious services for the dead, and really any service for the dead, also, of course, start to relax. The volume of dying was overwhelming to the medical people, as it were, but also to the local church. And as opposed to having, okay, so and so died today, we're going to go have a service, we'll perform a mass perhaps, and we will, we'll have a nice procession to the churchyard, where we will have a burial ceremony, and it'll be all very dignified and very traditional, and the right words will be said by the right people, and all of these things. And all of that just slowly withers away, because there's just too much. So pretty soon, it's lesser church types who are conducting these ceremonies, not necessarily the priests or bishops or whoever would normally do it, depending on the rank of the deceased. But ordinary non-clerical people, sometimes just muttering a few words and throwing them in a hole. Whether or not there was room in the churchyard became a very big issue. And eventually, he says, they went to mass graves, where, huge trenches were excavated, into which new arrivals were placed in their hundreds, stowed tier upon tier like ship's cargo, each layer of corpses being covered over with a thin layer of soil till the trench was filled to the top. This is not the whimsical intro I expect from a lighthearted group of stories meant to divert my, meant to divert me, meant to give me some entertainment. This is very, very real. It's not necessarily trying to be horrifying. It's not trying to stir emotions, I don't think. I think it's really just to catalog what is happening around him. And if you are horrified by that, then you're horrified by it. But this isn't necessarily trying to do that, I don't think. I think it's trying to remind you to be very clear-eyed about everything around you. The good and the happy and all of that, also the horrible. And don't take refuge in simple answers that make you just sort of look away. You know, oh, God's angry at us. What does that do? Where does that lead? How does that help? He's driving towards a vision of humanity pulling together in some fashion to try and mitigate the misery. He returns again and again to the idea of people being abandoned. Between March and July of the year in question, well, with the fury of the pestilence and the fact that so many of the sick were inadequately cared for or abandoned in their hour of need because the healthy were too terrified to approach them, it is reliably thought that over 100,000 lives were extinguished within the walls of the city of Florence. I would doubt numbers personally, but certainly all recent studies have suggested that across Europe it was devastating. As I said, like 30 to 50% or something like that of people died. Millions. It was a horror. The more I reflect upon all this misery, the deeper my sense of personal sorrow. Hence, I shall refrain from describing those aspects which can suitably be omitted. There's more, but he's trying to be delicate, perhaps. But he's not giving us everything he knows, and I believe that. And proceed to inform you that these were the conditions prevailing in our city, which was by now almost emptied of its inhabitants, when one Tuesday morning, he shifts like that into story mode. When one Tuesday morning, which is equivalent of just kicking in and saying, and now the plot begins. Once upon a time, there was. And it's a sudden jolt right in the middle of a sentence that, you know, after all of this horror, suddenly the story starts. And it's the story of 7 women, young women, early 20s, pretty much all relatively upper crust, fairly, you know, well off. They're not poor, and they're sitting around, and they've gone to church, as young ladies are supposed to do. They're all unmarried. They go to church, and they sit around afterwards, and they start talking and realizing that, well, yeah, you know, there aren't too many other people around anymore. Between everybody dying and running out of town, they're kind of alone. They realize, perhaps as well, that, well, it's pretty unhealthy to be around here. Then the logical next step is, well, you know, can we get out of town? Can we go somewhere? And they make a plan to go. They say that they have to bring along some men, because young women should not be traveling alone. The relationship of, or the portrayal of women is very complicated here. And at times it seems like Boccaccio is holding it up for some scorn. At other times it seems to be genuinely a little bit patriarchal and sexist. You know, you can't expect him to be particularly well evolved in the year 1348. he is or, well, we'll leave him aside. The women say, well, we can't travel alone. We need men. And suddenly, boom, 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 three men just walk in the door. Coincidences. The three men are, in one way or the other, romantically involved with or related to different members of the seven-member group. And they immediately say, "Oh, of course, we will go along with you, and we will be, we'll be the ones in charge, or whatever." So they make a plan, and they're going to leave the city. They go home, they pack up their stuff, they bring some servants along who don't get a lot of billing, but they do a lot of the work supporting all of these people because they're just going to be laying around telling stories all day. And then they leave. They leave. The introduction talks about how, and it shifts from this essay format to a more of a traditional narrative discourse. And they go out of town. It's not very far. They travel just like a couple of hours to get out of town, and presumably, they're not on the bullet train or anything. So, it's a fairly close little suburban place that they're going to. But it's apparently a very nice palace, I believe it is called. I think they actually use the word palazzo in the original. But it is it's very, very well furnished, very well stocked. They can just walk in, and suddenly it's perfect. And it's this Arcadian little wonder right in the middle where they can set up kind of an ideal refuge from the pestilence and the ugly city life that they left behind. And they do. They walk in, and they very quickly settle themselves in. They take stock of everything around them. Okay, we have plenty of food, we have plenty of firewood, we have this, we have that, everything's good. And they decide that, well, okay, they start talking in very high-minded terms. And they say, one of the women, the woman who more or less runs things, who's kind of you get the feeling of the oldest one, perhaps, and the more authority figure. The characters themselves are going to shift around, and they're very hard to keep track of, and I don't know who they are. I don't really care. The one with the most authority and the more prudent one, I think is the word that they tend to use, is those are two different people. But they tend to be the ones who are the most interesting to watch because they tend to be the smartest. But they come up with the idea, well, say, well, in order to have have true happiness, you have to have some structure in life. And you can't have just chaos, which is an interesting notion. Again, sort of Middle Ages, which is very into structure and very ornate and rigorously defined architecture to all systems. Again, think in terms of the complications of Dante's hierarchy of hell and purgatory and heaven. They come up with the idea that, okay, we need to have some structure, so we're going to have a schedule. So we're going to get up every day, we're going to have some free time, we're going to get together at like, I think 9 a.m. I wonder when they're actually getting up. I don't know. They're going to have like certain things, and after lunch, they're going to have a lavish little garden party lunch. And then after that, there's going to be like a little siesta time, everybody's going to rest. And then in the second half of the afternoon, when it's really hot and too hot to really do anything, physical, they would all gather together in this one little pasture under a shade tree or something, and they would relax, and they would tell stories. This was the plan. They're each going to tell one story a day. Now, there were 7 women. There are 3 men. That is 10. 10. And 10 stories over the span of the next 10 days. There are a couple of days in there that get mixed up with housework. and other things. It's not every day, but it's roughly a 2-week span. They have 10 storytelling days, 10 stories over 10 days, or each of 10 days. And there you have Decameron, the 10-day experiment. Emera, I think, it's a Greek term. Deca is 10. Emera means, a span of, or something like that, right? For a duration of 10 days. And they're going to do this. And this is all to pass the time. And the stories themselves are going to be merely for entertainment, perhaps some for edification, for the moral improvement of the attendees, but the underlying purpose of it that is not so explicitly stated is that it is supposed to be a diversion. It is supposed to be a refuge. They are in this beautiful place, and they are fresh from the visions of horror back in Florence, and they are trying to come to grips with what they have seen over the last few months. If it started ravaging in late 47, this is the spring of 48. You get the sense that it's fairly late in the spring. I forget the actual date. I think it's actually June. So it's, it's been going on for a while. They've seen an awful lot. And these stories then are going to give them some perspective on it, perhaps, or at least a way of putting their mind elsewhere, or giving them an objective view of it through art. The stories are almost all quite charming, quite innocent, very simple stories. There's nothing terribly involved in any of them. A lot of them are really quite short, just a few pages. Some of them are longer, but none of them are particularly complex narratives in the sense of like a modern novel or even a short story. They all have a sort of parable feel to them, as devout readers of the Bible would be most comfortable with. The idea throughout, though, is that these 10 people are all coming together for the purpose of comforting one another, of providing some distraction, some succor, some solace to one another in a very, very difficult time. And it does work that way. The characterizations are barely characterizations. We're not supposed to really think of them as human beings so much as just, little toy figures in a little play drama almost, or diorama almost, that's playing out. But there's a sweetness in that. There's an innocence in that. There's a simplicity in that that is very appealing. And that's helpful. That gets people through the horrors. Nobody really wants the intensity and the rigor of the first half of that introduction, when all of the stats about the plague year are coming out. Everybody needs to know that, everybody should know that, and it's there because they should. Boccaccio is making them know that. But there's a time for that, and there's a time for, taking a different look at it. Going about the same basic puzzle by different means. And that's where I would say Boccaccio is really aiming to try and show the richness of the human capacity, the human mind, to balance the horrors it has seen against the joy of art, of coming together, of humanity itself. You can't have one without the other. That's what this book, that's what this whole book is getting across.